This critique examines a comprehensive grammar and composition manuscript dedicated to formalizing the rules, syntax, and literary structures of the Thaetiangika language. Elevating the unique linguistic features of Thaetiangika earlier in the text will immediately capture the reader's interest and establish the language's distinct identity.
Right, because I mean, looking at the notes here, the manuscript opens with a very traditional, heavily historical framing, before getting into the actual mechanics of the language itself.
Yeah, exactly. We get extensive geographic distributions across Bihar and Jharkhand, and George Grierson's historical linguistic classifications right in the opening pages.
Which, I mean, that certainly sets the stage.
It does, but the thing is, the most fascinating and distinguishing markers of the language are currently just buried deep within the later chapters.
Yeah.
They're essentially treated as standard, run-of-the-mill grammatical rules, rather than the brilliant linguistic triumphs that they actually are.
That makes sense, but could the evidence also support a different conclusion, like standardizing the chapter flow to mirror traditional Hindi or Maithili grammar books? Because I imagine the author felt a strong obligation to prove the academic legitimacy of Thaetiangika by mirroring the structural progression of established Indo-Aryan textbooks, right?
Oh, for sure, yeah.
But if you follow that traditional, almost rigid academic progression, starting with phonetics, then slowly walking through nouns, pronouns, adjectives, and eventually verbs, you inadvertently end up placing your most compelling evidence for the language's independence all the way in the back half of the book.
I can totally see what you're going for here. Let's see how we can strengthen this, because right now, it feels a bit like hiding the lead actor in the chorus until the third act.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
I mean, we are talking about some truly exceptional linguistic mechanics here. If a reader is looking for what makes the Tianga fundamentally different from its sister languages, like Magahi or Maithili, they currently have to wait until Chapter 7 to find it.
Chapter 7. Wow.
Yeah. And that is where the text introduces the highly unique listener-related verb forms known as the Shrota Samband.
And I mean, the Shrota Samband is an absolute marvel of linguistics. Like, in this language, the verbs change based on the listener, not just the speaker or the subject.
Exactly. If I am talking to a respected elder about, say, a dog running across the street, the verb describing the dog's action alters its form to show respect to the person I am speaking to.
That is just, it's wild.
It really is. The verb conjugates based on the audience's status, regardless of who or what we are speaking about. That is structurally incredible. And furthermore, the nuanced existential versus identity distinction between the verbs chai and chakai is also tucked away in that exact same later chapter.
That's fascinating. What are the potential limitations or counter-arguments to that idea, though?
Like what?
Well, if we restructure the opening chapters or, say, create a dedicated unique features primer right after the introduction to spotlight these specific elements, doesn't that risk confusing the reader?
Oh, I see what you mean.
Right, because one might strongly argue that a reader needs to understand basic phonetic rules and simple nouns before they can even begin to tackle something as complex as a listener-related verb conjugation. Won't a beginner get completely overwhelmed before they even learn the alphabet?
That is a completely fair concern, but I think it misunderstands the purpose of an opening hook.
Okay, how so?
A primer doesn't have to teach the full, exhaustive conjugation of these complex verbs, right? It just has to showcase the feature's existence. It acts as an appetizer.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, it tells the reader, look at the depth and complexity we are eventually going to uncover. You can move the explanation of the 3 noun forms from Chapter 3 directly into this new highlighted preface, or maybe a Chapter 1 breakout box.
Right, because the text details how nouns take a short, long, and extra long form.
Exactly. For example, moving from a standard noun like fudna to the elongated fudanma. Bring that right to the front. Similarly, you pull the che versus chekai distinction from Chapter 7 into this opening section.
Yeah.
Instead of making the reader wait until page 21 to find out how Thaetiangika uniquely handles the Shrota Samband, showcase this immediately as the language's crown jewel.
I see. So you are using these features as the undeniable proof of why this language requires its own distinct grammar book in the first place.
Right. You are taking the core thesis of the manuscript that Thithiangika is a robust, wholly independent language and proving it on page 1 with structural evidence that cannot be ignored.
Yes. Because, if I am a linguist or even a native speaker trying to formalize my understanding of my mother tongue, seeing that existential versus identity distinction highlighted immediately tells me this author understands the deep, subtle mechanics of the language.
Precisely, because the distinction between those two verbs is incredibly sophisticated. I mean, the verb chai tells me something simply exists in the universe, like water existing in a glass.
Right.
But chakai tells me the specific inherent identity of that liquid is water, and absolutely nothing else. It is the difference between mere presence and fundamental essence. Highlighting that brilliant nuance early on builds immediate trust with the reader.
Exactly. It fundamentally changes the reading experience. Rather than slogging through generic definitions of vowels and consonants, wondering when the unique character of Bianca will finally appear, the reader is motivated.
Exactly.
They know the destination is worth the journey.
So a key theme running through this material seems to be the transition from the theoretical mechanics of the language into its practical application, particularly as we move from the first half of the manuscript into the second.
Right, the jump from grammar to composition.
Yeah.
Bridging the current disconnect between the highly specific grammar section and the generic composition section will make the entire manuscript feel like a unified, practical guide.
That's clearly laid out. I wonder, though, if we've considered the psychological shift the reader experiences at this midpoint, because right now, the transition is quite jarring. It really is.
Part 1 is deeply rooted in the specific, localized mechanics of Thediangika. We just spent all this time uncovering extra-long nouns and identity verbs. But then Part 2, which covers composition or Rachana Kala, violently pivots to generic definitions of essays, letters, and poetry.
Okay, so what I really like about this part, though, is that the author clearly wants to provide a comprehensive all-in-one guide.
Sure.
They are painstakingly giving the structural definitions of literature, what an essay is, what defines a one-act play, how to structure a reportage or a memoir. They want this to be the only book a student of the language ever needs to buy.
Is there a risk that focusing solely on the structural definitions of literature in Part 2 might overlook the opportunity to showcase the living language in action?
Oh, absolutely.
Because the definitions provided in the current draft could easily apply to any language on Earth. An essay structure, having an introduction, a body, and a conclusion, is structurally identical whether you are writing in English, Standard Hindi, French, or Thediangia.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't really need a localized, highly specialized grammar book to tell us that an essay has a conclusion. When you separate the grammar from the composition so cleanly, you are treating the language as a historical artifact rather than a vibrant tool for modern creation.
I entirely agree. We need to infuse the composition chapters with the specific Thedianga cultural contexts, stylistic markers, and vocabulary rules that were meticulously detailed in Part 1.
Right.
The goal here should be to show the reader exactly how to apply the grammar they just spent 100 pages learning to actual creative writing.
So how would that look in practice? Like if we strip out the generic structural definitions, what replaces them?
Well, instead of just providing a generic definition of an essay's 3-act structure, provide a sample essay written in Thithiangika that explicitly showcases the use of the 3 noun forms.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Yeah. Or write an essay that heavily features the unique o and ow nasal vowel endings that the text highlights earlier as a signature phonological marker of the language.
I see.
And when dealing with the letter writing section, rather than just defining the difference between a formal and informal letter, provide examples of Thithiangika-specific salutations. Even better, incorporate the localized idioms taught in Chapter 14 to demonstrate how tone is achieved in this specific language.
Oh yeah, the idioms. The material makes a strong case for the richness of its idioms by highlighting phrases like dahi mein masoor,
Right.
which literally translates to lentils in yogurt, meaning a severe mismatch or something completely out of place.
Exactly. So use dahi mein masoor in a sample informal letter to a friend. Show the reader how the tone of the language shifts from formal to intimate when these localized phrases are employed.
That creates a brilliant internal ecosystem.
Yeah.
If the text explains in Part 1 that the language has unique phonological shifts, like swapping the L and R sounds so that the standard word nabi for river becomes ladi, show that phonological shift happening dynamically within a sample narrative, or a one-act play in the composition section. Have a character from a specific region use that pronunciation to establish their background.
It is all about cohesion. If you teach me how to build a specialized high-performance engine in Part 1, Part 2 shouldn't just be a dictionary definition of what a car is, right?
Right, it should show me that specific engine running on the open road.
Exactly. The reader needs to see how the syntax dictates the rhythm of a Thathiangika poem. They need to see how that Shrota-Sambandh verb agreement we talked about earlier changes the power dynamics between characters in a LAC play.
Oh, wow.
If a character suddenly stops using the respectful verb conjugation when talking to their elder, that is a massive dramatic shift. The composition section should highlight how a writer utilizes those grammatical tools for dramatic effect.
Building on that point, what if we looked at it from the perspective of cultural preservation?
Okay, I like that.
Because a language doesn't survive simply because its grammar is codified in a textbook. It survives because it is used to tell compelling stories, to complain to a neighbor, to write a business proposal, to sing songs.
Yeah, it has to be lived.
By tightly weaving the unique grammatical rules into the composition examples, the manuscript naturally transitions from a static reference book into a dynamic blueprint for the language's future vitality.
Transforming the chapter-end exercises from rote memorization to applied, context-driven practice will drastically improve the reader's ability to actually use and internalize the language.
That makes a lot of sense.
Because when you read through the manuscript, you reach the end of these incredibly rich, detailed chapters, and the exercises present a surprisingly academic, dry format.
Yeah, the current exercises at the end of each chapter rely almost entirely on basic recall questions. You see prompts like, write the definition of a noun, or name the 6 parts of speech.
Right.
This approach solely tests a reader's short-term memory of grammatical terms, rather than their practical acquisition of the language itself.
It is testing whether they can remember the label printed on the side of the tool, rather than testing if they actually know how to swing the hammer.
But is the connection between active language acquisition and rote memorization fully established in the material, or is that an area to potentially bolster? I can imagine the author arguing that before a student can manipulate a language, they must be able to define its parts.
Right. Like laying down the foundation.
Exactly. Don't we need a baseline of definitions to ensure everyone is on the exact same page?
We have to consider the target audience here, though. If the target audience consists of native speakers trying to formalize their understanding, or professional linguists analyzing the structure, asking them to define a pronoun is entirely redundant.
Yeah, that's true.
They already know what a pronoun is fundamentally. They need to be tested on how Thathiangika handles pronouns differently than Magahi or Bengali. The pedagogy of language learning has moved far away from recitation over the last few decades.
So what's the alternative?
We need to redesign the exercises to present real-world linguistic problems, translation challenges, or creative prompts that require the reader to actively use the rules they just learned.
Let's explore how that would function chapter by chapter. In Chapter 6, which covers adjectives, instead of asking a rote question like, what are the 4 types of adjectives, you could provide a short, highly descriptive paragraph written in standard Hindi and ask the reader to translate it into Thathiangika.
Okay, I love that. Crucially, you would require them to use the specific counting affixes detailed in the text, such as ta, go, or to.
That is a massive upgrade. Translating a paragraph forces the reader to make active contextual decisions. They can't just list the affixes. They have to look at the noun in the sentence and decide whether ta or go is the grammatically correct choice for that specific scenario.
Right.
It forces them to engage with the cognitive mechanics of the language. And for Chapter 7, rather than asking the reader to list the 5 main auxiliary verbs, provide a sentence that deliberately misuses the existential cha instead of the identity chaikai.
Oh, that's clever.
Ask the reader to identify the error, correct it, and explain in their own words why using the wrong verb fundamentally changes the meaning of the sentence.
It pushes them to actually think in Thathiangika. You could apply the same active practice to the prefixes and suffixes from Chapter 10, too.
How so?
Give the reader a root word and ask them to apply different affixes to change its function. from a noun to an adjective, for instance. Or ask them to give the root word a derogatory connotation, using the yaya suffix, like taking the standard word for a bed, cot, and turning it into katia.
It allows the reader to play with the language to get their hands dirty. If the ultimate goal of this manuscript is language preservation and vitality, the exercises absolutely must encourage creation in Tethyanjika, not just definition recitation.
Exactly. Consider Chapter 8, which focuses on indeclinable words or particles. Don't ask the reader to simply list the 4 types of indeclinable words. Give them a plain sentence without any emphasis particles, the nipat, like a or all.
Okay.
Then, ask them to rewrite the sentence 3 different ways to emphasize a different specific word each time, demonstrating how inserting that tiny particle shifts the entire emotional weight and focus of the phrase.
It completely changes the posture of the reader. They transition from a passive student sitting at a desk into an active practitioner stepping into a workshop.
Yeah, they aren't just absorbing a rulebook anymore. They are building sentences. And frankly, for a reader who's already deeply invested in this linguistic topic, applied translation and error correction exercises are simply much more engaging and enjoyable to solve.
It honors the intelligence of the reader. It essentially says to them, you understand the overarching theory. Now let's see how deftly you can manipulate this living, breathing language. It turns a dry academic test into a puzzle.
To summarize our critique of this comprehensive grammar and composition manuscript, we focused on 3 high-level opportunities to maximize its overall impact and readability.
Right.
First, front-loading the language's unique grammatical quirks, like the incredibly complex listener-related verbs and the nuanced existential verbs, moving them out of the later chapters and into an opening primer to hook the reader immediately and prove the language's independence.
Which is huge.
Second, bridging the gap between theory and practice by weaving those specific linguistic features, idioms, and stylistic markers directly into the generic composition section so the text functions as a unified practical ecosystem.
Yeah.
And finally, upgrading the end-of-chapter exercises from rote memorization and definition recitation into active, context-driven translation and application challenges.
These adjustments will take an already meticulous and deeply researched manuscript and elevate it into a truly dynamic practical guide that fully honors the unique identity and vibrant future of the language.
We warmly invite the listener to implement these structural suggestions and submit their revised work back into the show for another critique. Because as you'll often find when restoring a historic, centuries-old palace, you don't hide your most brilliant architectural discoveries in the basement. You want to make sure the crown jewels are catching the light the moment the doors open.